From district icons to people whose longtime loyal service to the Plymouth Canton Community Schools made the district what it is today. These are the stories of the people of P-CCS. It's My P-CCS Life on 88.1 The Park.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of My P-CCS Life on 88.1 The Park. I'm Nick Brandon, and I'm honored to introduce our guest for the third edition of a show that shares the stories behind the dedicated professionals whose work for the district helped make Plymouth Canton Community Schools what it is today. Our guest for the third edition of this series made an indelible impact on the P-CCS community. So much so, in fact, that we're splitting our chat with her into two parts because she's just got too many good stories to fit into just one show. The first part of our chat will air tonight on 88.1 The Park, and the second will be released next week on the official P-CCS YouTube channel. Sharon Belobraidich was instrumental in the learning journeys of generations of students, including yours truly, and she is, at heart, a teacher. Her service to the district spanned 5 decades, and we are thrilled to have her here with us today. Here is her P-CCS life. I've been able to reconnect with more of my former teachers than I would have ever imagined. But one of my challenges is I don't know what to call them. I don't know whether to call you Mrs. Bello, Sharon.
Some kids I had call me Sharon, but it kind of depends on my relationship with them now. You know, it's just Mrs. Bello is usually what happens, or Bello.
Bello, yeah. I think I'm going to go with Mrs. Bello. That just feels right. But Mrs. Bello, it is amazing to have you in. Thanks for joining us on My P-CCS Life.
You're very welcome.
Your road is a long one, but surprisingly not many stops. You started in 1964 at Byrd Elementary School, which is where I was fortunate enough to get to know you. In 1973, you went to Miller Elementary School. You went back to Byrd in 74. You were there until 1987 and then finished your career with a 15-year run at Hoban. 5 decades. Why education?
I wanted to be a teacher when I was 4 years old. I just didn't know you had to go to college. I thought you just had to grow up and be smart to teach small children. It was the only thing I ever wanted to do, was be a teacher. I had a couple of really phenomenal teachers when I was real small, and I really molded myself after my second grade teacher. Her name was Mrs. Ruthig, and I absolutely adored her.
Were you one of those kids that played school? Did you set up a school room in your house?
My teddy bears, yeah, they were my students. And if they didn't listen,
Yeah, I'm sure they heard about it. I know a young guy who didn't listen very much sometimes and occasionally had to be redirected.
Well, redirection is important for first graders because sometimes they lose their way during the day.
I know that the piano is an interesting part of your career and background, too. You taught piano before you taught in a classroom. Mm-hmm. How did those two things intermingle?
I lived out in Big Beaver, Michigan, which is now Troy, 16-mile road. Somerset, that type of thing. That's where I grew up on a farm. When you live on a farm, you don't have a lot of time for playing piano or anything else. People across the street had an old upright piano and they were going to move. So they asked my mom if she wanted the piano because I was just mesmerized by the piano. My mother didn't like music, so we didn't listen to music. So I grew up with very little music. I came home from school one day, and there was the piano. I was in 3rd grade. I'll never forget it. I remember thinking, and I don't know why, but I did, this is going to change my life. And it did, because I just went to my 64th class reunion last week, and one guy didn't remember my name, but he said, "That's the piano lady." And so that's what I became because I was the only kid in my high school that played the piano. On top of buying this piano and moving it into our home, which was a major thing, my mother took money out of her grocery money for me to have lessons. Completely changed my life.
You know, from one musician who's an educator to another musician who's an educator, there does seem to be this commonality for a lot of people. Maybe it's not just music, it's all of arts, but I think there's a connection between music or being inspired by music or having that be a central part of your life and wanting to work with young people and inspire them as well.
Absolutely.
You can't be a good piano teacher without learning some basics of management, shall we say. Mm-hmm. How did teaching piano influence your classroom management or your ability to work with a group of people and get them from one place to another in terms of learning?
Number one, you have to be really organized. I got to school every morning. I was the first person after the janitor. And then Dave Wirt, he was the second. And so we would sit with our car windows next to each other, roll down and talk until the janitor got there and we could get into the building. You have to be organized, because if you're not, guess who else isn't? Organization is a learned skill. I would walk into my classroom at 8:15 or whenever the doors opened, and everything would be done in packets on my desk for the whole day. I didn't have to worry about doing it at lunchtime, so that if something came up, I didn't have a problem. And I had teachers who criticized me for that. They'd say, "You're such a good union member. What are you doing here at 6:15 in the morning?" I said, being a teacher and being a good union member has nothing to do with one another. My time in my classroom, I don't even think about that. My time over here, I don't think about the other one. I separated the two because I knew that for me to be organized and for me to know that I had everything at hand for the whole day, that made me a much better teacher than if I was running around crazy trying to find a copier that wouldn't work or something like that.
You arrive in 1964. For our younger listeners, what did P-CCS look like in 1964, and what did Bird Elementary look like in 1964?
Well, there were 5 elementary buildings. There were 2 middle schools, and there was 1 high school. Sheldon Road was 2-lane. They didn't widen that until they put Ford Motor Company out at the north, and they had to have it for the traffic. The overpasses went in after the 2 boys were killed trying to get to West Middle School to go to a Halloween party. It's very interesting when I think back to what it looked like. It didn't have the 3 rooms at the back. It was just a normal building with 3, but it didn't have 2 sides of rooms on each hallway like it does now. I walk in and I can hardly believe how few rooms there were. My room was at the end of the second hallway in the 3rd, 4th wing, and I was teaching 2nd grade. And I had Mary Maley. She walked into class the first morning and she said, "Mrs. Bello, do you know why we don't have any bank robberies in Plymouth?" And I went, "I'm brand new to the community. I never lived here." And I went, "No, Mary, I don't." She said, "They'd get stopped by a train." And I had never heard that, and I didn't know what she meant because I hadn't lived here that long. I said, "Mary," the other day when I saw it, that wasn't even a joke. I said, "But you made it seem that way." It was much simpler in those days. I was down the older wing. I had 38 children in my classroom that year.
Wow.
So did the other 2 second grade teachers.
And you mentioned you grew up in, is it Troy?
It's Troy now.
Yeah.
It was Big Beaver in those days because it was a little burg. It was like Livonia when they took Livonia and took all the little burgs of Livonia and pushed it all together.
Yes.
And they did that to Troy the same year they did it in Livonia.
So how did you end up in Plymouth?
Oh, I would never have gone back home. I had no desire to go back to Troy where my relatives lived. I kind of was done with that experience. My husband was a geologist, and in 1963 it was very hard to find jobs in geology because of the political situation in Iran and Iraq. So oil jobs were not to be thought about. One of the professors from state sent his name in to the highway department and said he knows all about finding materials under the ground. That was when the expressway system was just beginning. He went to interview, and he got past the first interview, the one in East Lansing, and the next week he had to go to Ann Arbor because that's where the main office was. And off we went to Ann Arbor, and he came out of the job interview, and I thought, I'll know if he got the job when I see how he walks, because he was kind of a bouncer when he was happy. So I could see him coming down through all those people in Ann Arbor bouncing. So anyway, he had gotten the job, and he was going to start the next Monday. But we didn't have any place to live, and we were living in Warren with his parents because they were going to California for the winter. So we started looking, and my brother-in-law, it's funny how this happened, he's an insurance man, and he had a client, and he said, "We're going to sell the house. Do you know anybody who would want to buy it?" He said, "Yeah, I think I do." So for $11,000, my husband and I bought a house right down by the police department. On that $11,000, we came to Plymouth, and they told us, don't go to Ann Arbor to live because of the taxes. So this was perfect. I drove him in every morning to work and then went back home because we had one car, dropped the little one off at nursery school, and then went to bird school, and then did the back, reversed it, and brought him home at the end of the day. And it was just a wonderful life. I loved living here. Because I'm a history major, there isn't any better place to live than Plymouth when you're a history. I've worked for the museum ever since I retired.
We'll get to some of your community connections because that's one of them that I find fascinating. But I do want to backtrack to, what is the role of college in your life? Because I know this is an interesting thing about your background.
Yeah.
In a much different time, but, inform our community about what college looked like for a woman in the 1960s.
Well, it didn't look very good at my house. First of all, I was a business major in high school, so I could take shorthand at 350 words a minute, and I could type at 120. So when they sent our scores in to all over, I got a high recommendation for the civil service exam because I got a great score. I had the choice of a job in Wayne, Oakland, or Macomb County. So I went to work for the government. I went to work for the people who were building missiles. Cost $8,000 in those years to secure you through secret. Well, I didn't know what that meant. I'm 17 years old. I'm thinking, oh, okay. So I ended up working for the head of the missile department at Chrysler Corporation. It was separate from Chrysler, but it was government. Nicest man that ever walked the face of the earth. I had two really great bosses. I mean, Werner von Braun walked in one day. He'd been brought over here after the war. I mean, my eyeballs bounced out of my head and, back onto my paper that I was typing. I was just really naive. But my boss was so wonderful. He said to me one day, do you understand when you're talking about this cap that goes on this thing, what that means? And I said, well, sort of. And he said, I think you and I should go down into the factory. And when we got into the factory, he was such a perfect man. He just was kind and he was so respectful. He said, now don't stand too close to the edge because the men that are working down in the pit, they will look up under your skirt. I couldn't believe it. So anyway, that was, how I got this wonderful job. I'm making more money than my dad's making at General Motors, and he's worked there for 40 years. This is what he's looking at. So all of a sudden, I want to go to college. He says, no. And so then I got my scholarship. And so when the scholarship came, and I had to forge his name on that paper so that I could get my scholarship. I hope they're not listening.
Your big admission here on my
that's
P-CCS
that's the only thing I ever did that was dishonest. And I forged his name because I wanted to go so bad. He just couldn't believe that I would give up that wonderful job. And I said, but I don't want to be a secretary and be blamed for things I didn't do. I'd already worked as a secretary. I knew what that meant. And the boss can't find something. Guess who lost it? I never touched it. I stand up for my rights when I get blamed. That was how I got there. Now, when I went to teach, I'm standing in my classroom the first year, and John Glenn flew over in the missile that I helped build. And I didn't do anything with the missile, but I wrote the papers and I, did all that kind of work with it. I just had to fight with my dad every day at the dinner table about, yes, I'm going to quit my job, and yes, I'm going to do this, and yes, I'm going to do this. And he just had never had a daughter that did. I had 3 sisters. They didn't fight. If he said no, they just, okay. And I wasn't like that.
Well, there's already kind of a running theme of you as a little bit of a rebel. You wanted to get out of your hometown. You wanted something different. And you sort of went against the grain when it comes to the recommendations that your dad was giving you. You clearly wanted to carve your own path. And I do think that there's a common theme sometimes with teachers that they kind of like to be in charge. Somebody who does want to lead. Maybe that's a better way of saying it than being in charge. But I'm certainly picking up on a theme of independence. It sounds like that's one of the factors that led you to P-CCS.
I never, ever gave a thought of leaving here. There isn't anything better than going to the picnic basket and have somebody come up behind you and stand as close to you as he can get without being rude. And I turn around and it's a former student, and he said, I saw you pick up about 3 heavy pots of flowers. Is that your little blue Bronco out there that's sitting in the parking lot? And I said, yes. And he said, well, when you come out, I'm going to be standing right there to put those pots in your car. There isn't anything that can replace that in my life. Nothing. And that's the kind of relationship. I don't think I had a truly bad relationship with any child I ever had. When I left the building at night, I thought about what I did. How could I have done it better? How could I have changed it so it would have made it better for them? That's what I thought about when I went home. My husband used to say, do you ever really leave teaching? He said, because you seem to be like thinking about it. And I said, I think about kids all the time.
I think that's one of the key differences between educators and non-educators is this understanding of that the work never ends. It truly never ends.
No.
If you're doing it right, or if you have the passion that we all have, you're thinking about it pretty much all day, all night. How many times do you wake up in the middle of the night with some idea for a lesson? It happened to me all the time. And I don't know why. It would just, and then the next day I would implement it. And it was always a lot of fun to do that.
Well, and many times those are the things that work. I always tried to use, my instincts about kids. And some children, there are children that you have to just really work at and think about a lot in order to get to them. I just saw a gal about 3 years ago. She came up to me I was working the Halloween thing out of the museum, and she stood in the line, and I saw her, and I knew who she was immediately. She walked up, and she said, "Mrs. Bello, do you know who I am?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "I know why you know who I am." And I said, "Well, I had you in first grade." And she said, "No, I asked you where babies came from." And she said, to this day, I remember the look on your face, because, I mean, that's not a question. I think I said something mundane like, maybe you ought to ask your mom that question. But I knew exactly who she was. And she said, "I cannot believe with all the kids you've had that you remember me." And I said, "I try to remember them all."
But what I know is that you remember a lot. I mean, I'm stunned by the clarity that you have of the 1980s. I don't remember as much about being at Bird Elementary School as I think you do. It's amazing.
You were a part of it. I was outside of it in so many ways.
But your passion was always evident. I mean, I don't think the decade that I was there is any different from now, in the sense that, our district has tremendous teachers at all levels district-wide, but there are some that are obviously just special. There are some that have this sort of, burning desire for the profession and for the art of teaching. And you absolutely had that. I mean, you were the favorite teacher. You're the one everybody wanted. You were. Do you know that?
Mm-mm. No. My kids, when they were in school, they would say, the kids that were in my class, many of them wanted to have you, and they were not very happy. Which doesn't always make you a very popular person in the building.
Yes, I would imagine.
I had a problem. I had a couple of problems with that. That wasn't important to me. That's your problem. That's not my problem. I don't have a problem with you, so I can't control that.
But you brought it every day. I think that's what I remember the most. There were no days off. There were no times where you just didn't have the energy that day.
I left my problems. I had problems at home. I left them at home. When I went home, I dealt with those problems. When I got to school, I didn't take my children home either. Maybe occasionally, and I'd say to my girls, if I ever hear this story, I'll know who told it, because I don't tell stories about my children. I do not ever want it to come back to me. They were true blue, because one was, first grade. She's in the room down the hall, and, the day my daughter was swinging upside down on the swing, I'm on recess duty. She's swinging and catches her head and takes the top of her hair off. So I can't run her into the office, so I sent her in with a kid. You have to separate the two. You can't be mama on the playground and she's standing holding on to me. Took about 8 years for the hair to grow out, as I remember.
Well, we earlier on an edition, actually in our debut edition of the show, we spoke with Dr. Jim Burt, and we covered the idea of his role as a teacher/principal and parent. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love your take on that as well. What was your journey like in terms of having your own kids be part of your school? Well,
I always tried to keep myself separate. I didn't, I'll take care of that. No, I didn't do that. I only had one altercation where that needed to be done, and I went in and made a conference, or had a conference just like anybody else would have, and told her how I felt about what it was, and left, and we always spoke. And
Dr. Burt mentioned, and I was inspired by this, that
I worked with Jim Burt.
Yes, you did.
At Miller.
He mentioned that being able to have his kids in his building gave him a tremendous way to spend more time with his kids, even though he created those separations, drew those lines, but he also really appreciated, with the busyness of an educator, that he got to spend a little more time with his kids than he otherwise would have if they weren't at his school. Did you have the same experience?
They always knew what was going on in the building more than I did. I knew what was going on in my classroom because that was what was important to me. I'd hear things, I'd go, seriously?
They're like your reporters.
Yeah. Keeping tabs. And of course, they were 9 years apart. So Ellen was a baby when Karen went to middle school. So there weren't two of them at the same, so they didn't have support there. You know, they were lone men in the building. So it was different.
That's a good note to pause our chat with Mrs. Bello on, and I cannot wait to share more stories from this great lady and iconic teacher next week when part 2 of our chat with Mrs. Bello premieres on the P-CCS official YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, P-CCS Official, right now so you can get notifications when part 2 of this chat is available. I'm Nick Brandon, and you've been listening to My P-CCS Life on 81 The Park with longtime P-CCS teacher Sharon Belobraidich. My P-CCS Life airs live on 81 The Park on the first Friday of every month. You can find past episodes of the program on the podcast page of 81thepark.com and on the official P-CCS YouTube channel. Thanks for being with us, and good evening.